People called Parker Hale a madman when he spent his family's last $50 on a dying flock of sheep. The merchants scoffed that he had just bought a winter he couldn't afford. But when the most devastating blizzard in history swept through and every fire died out, the entire town of Greyhaven woke up to a stunning realization. The only thing keeping them breathing was the very thing they had mocked at the auction. In April 1886, Parker Hale returned to Harrow Ridge after 6 years repairing drive belts, pulleys, and steam equipment in mining camps and sawmills. He came home because success had found him, but more importantly, because his father had been killed when a logging wagon overturned on the Granite Horn slope. His mother, Miriam Hale, had managed to keep the house and 63 rocky acres, but the fences sagged, the hay meadow had gone wild, and hauling firewood alone was becoming impossible. The old barn measured 34 by 52 feet. Built from seasoned ash and lodgepole pine, its north roof had begun to sag, yet the frame remained square. A newer shed, built with green lumber, had already twisted apart at its joints. Throughout the spring, Parker threw himself into the work repairing wagon wheels, replacing fence posts, and measuring the barn roof one beam at a time. He discovered that old buildings survived because they allowed wood to move, moisture to escape, and wind to pass where it should. From that day forward, every repair and every mistake went into a small notebook. One evening in August 1886, Miriam found Parker repairing the worn saddle that had once belonged to her grandfather, Amon Vale. Quietly, she mentioned that Amon had raised a small mountain strain of sheep on rocky hillsides where larger breeds never lasted. Inside the old tack chest, Parker discovered a leather-bound notebook. The first pages listed breeding dates, hay stores, and sheep lost each winter. Later entries described a double-coated fleece, long outer fibers that shed melting snow, and fine, crimped underwool that trapped warm air. Amon explicitly noted that too much natural lanolin should never be washed away, and the two layers had to be separated before spinning. He had also recorded every mistake. A barn sealed too tightly would kill a flock. Wool ruined by water that was too hot. A blanket woven too densely to breathe. On the last scorched page, one sentence remained: "A thing can be cheap at auction and dear in a storm." Miriam never urged Parker to find those sheep. She simply said the Vale strain had disappeared because the market had learned to pay more for meat than for good wool. Before closing the notebook, she lifted a tiny lock of fleece pressed between two pages, breathed in its faint scent of lanolin, and quietly laid it back where Amon had left it. Parker did not begin searching for the flock immediately. For nearly 2 months, he tested every claim in Amon's notebook. He visited old homesteads, examined worn blankets stored in cedar chests, and asked locals why the Vale sheep had disappeared. At an abandoned mission, he met Agnes Bell, a 68-year-old Scottish widow who had once spun wool for wagon trains. She recognized the pressed lock of fleece immediately. "It was never meant for fine shirts," she explained. "Its strength came from tough outer fibers, springy under wool that trapped air, and just enough natural lanolin to shed wet snow. But it was slow to sort, uneven to spin, and easy to ruin with careless weaving." Later, Parker visited Edwin Moss, an elderly weaver. He still owned a freight wagon blanket made from Vale wool more than 30 years earlier. The edges were worn away, but the center still held its loft. Edwin squeezed the old blanket between his hands, then looked toward the dismantled loom in his loft. "I never thought I'd see this wool again," he said quietly. "It's been 18 years since any fleece made me want to build that loom back up." Late November, 1886. An early cold swept across Greyhaven before most families had finished stacking their winter firewood. Wind rolled through the railroad yard without slowing. It slipped between the fence rails, across the frozen ground, and into the livestock pens. 150 small sheep stood pressed into a single corner. Their curved horns were dusted with ice, and their long, tangled wool held patches of frozen snow. The flock had belonged to an aging shepherd who had recently died alone. His creditors claimed everything he owned, including the sheep. But no rancher wanted them. They were smaller than the meat breeds, grew slowly, and their rough wool was difficult to sort and even harder to sell. The auctioneer lowered the price again and again, but silence answered every offer. Outside the fence stood Parker Hale. He ignored the biggest animals. His attention settled on something else. The flock had turned its backs to the wind. The longest wool covered the necks of the sheep, standing deeper inside the group. They were shielding one another, forming a living wall. When one ewe with a crooked horn suddenly collapsed, the others stepped around her without breaking the circle. Beneath the crust of ice, her hind leg twitched. Silas Vane, the largest sheep rancher in the valley, shook his head, refusing to buy. Horace Bellum, the wool buyer, also flatly declined. Thaddeus Crow, the man responsible for managing land loans around Greyhaven, quietly reminded Parker that exactly $50 remained between the Hale family and another unpaid debt. But when the auctioneer called once more, Parker stepped forward. $50. The yard fell silent. Silas laughed as the truth settled in. "You didn't buy sheep," he said. "You bought a winter you can't afford." Parker met his eyes. "Then winter will tell me what I bought." Behind them, Thaddeus closed his ledger. "Spring still comes," he said softly, "whether they live or not." With no money left for freight, Parker traded his father's pocket watch to the driver to haul the flock to Harrow Ridge. Silas reluctantly sent 2 ranch hands for the final climb, not because he trusted Parker or the sheep, but simply because he refused to watch them die of exhaustion on the road. As soon as they arrived, the old barn had to change. Parker divided it into 3 pens, sealed the lower drafts with straw and clay, but carefully left narrow vents beneath the roof ridge. That night, when the wind shifted, he built a rough baffle from scrap boards, forcing the cold air to turn before reaching the flock. The ewe with the crooked horn could not stand. Parker cut the ice from her hooves and laid her near the warmest inner wall. When the work was done, Miriam stood at the doorway looking at the flock. "How much flour is left?" she asked. 12 days, Parker answered. During the following week, Parker continued to seal the lower gaps in the barn. The air felt warmer, but after 3 nights, droplets covered the rafters. By dawn, the water froze and fell onto the sheep. Several animals began coughing. 2 lambs died without ever facing another strong draft. Parker had trapped the heat and the moisture with it. He reopened Eamon's notebook. Agnes arrived that afternoon, pressed her hand against a wet beam, and quietly said, "You've built the cold you're trying to keep out." Parker immediately removed a strip of boards beneath the roof ridge, opening high vents for damp air to escape. He added an angled baffle, replaced every patch of wet bedding, and dug a shallow drain along the south wall. Still, the losses continued. By early March 1887, 17 sheep were gone. 133 remained. Parker recorded every loss separately, refusing to hide 17 lives behind a single number. When he buried the 17th sheep, Miriam brought out a second shovel. She never spoke. She simply dug beside him until darkness covered the hillside. By late March 1887, the surviving sheep began to change. Beneath the dirty, weathered outer fleece, a fresh undercoat emerged. It carried a soft gray tint and a tight natural crimp. Parker started with the ewe marked by the crooked horn and the white ring around one eye. As he parted the long outer fibers, he found a layer of finer wool close to the skin. He pressed it between his fingers. It sprang back the moment he released it, leaving a pocket of air where his fingertips had been. He carried the sample inside. Miriam closed her eyes before examining it. She gently drew a single fiber through her fingers, then touched its tip to her lips to judge how dry it felt. When she opened her eyes, she handed it back. "That's Eamon's wool." Agnes Bell studied several more samples and divided the fleece into 3 grades. The long outer fibers belonged on the face and edges of a blanket. The stronger middle fibers would become the warp. The fine, crimped underwool belonged in the insulating center. Parker hired an elderly shearer from Pine Cut for 3 days. The first day, he only learned how to hold the sheep. The second, He practiced guiding hand shears close enough to preserve the full staple without cutting the skin. On the third day, he finished an entire sheep by himself. After the stained and damaged wool had been discarded, the flock yielded nearly 420 pounds of usable fleece. Silas rode over that afternoon. He picked up a handful, turned it toward the sunlight, and rubbed it slowly between his fingers. Then he looked at Parker. "Fine," he said. "Now tell me who's going to buy it." Parker looked at the stacked sacks of wool. For the first time since the auction, he realized finding the material had been easier than finding its future. Parker followed Eamon's notebook as carefully as he could. He made a weak lye from hardwood ash and warmed water in a large copper kettle. Afraid too much grease remained in the fleece, he let the water grow hotter than it should. Then he stirred the wool again and again. By the time he lifted it out, 18 pounds of fleece had shrunk into dense, felted clumps. He pulled at the fibers until they snapped apart. The entire batch was ruined. Agnes looked at the pile without saying a word. Then she handed Parker another sack of fleece. "Start over." She explained that wool was rarely damaged by hot water alone. It failed when heat, sudden temperature changes, and rough movement worked together. Every wash tub had to stay close to the same temperature. The fleece should be pressed beneath the surface, never stirred. Enough lanolin had to remain for the fibers to protect themselves. The second batch survived. Edwin Moss rebuilt his old loom in the church loft, and Parker wove the first blanket with as much outer fleece as he could use. It was strong. It was durable. It also weighed nearly 16 pounds. After one cold night, Dr. Elias Ward tested it on an elderly patient. The blanket held warmth well, but by morning the man's nightshirt had become damp with trapped moisture. Parker opened his notebook and wrote a single line. "Warm is not enough if the body stays wet." That evening, Miriam found him staring at the ruined felted wool. He had set it aside, hoping to save it somehow. Without speaking, she placed a sharp knife beside him. Parker looked at the ruined fleece for another moment. Then he cut it apart. Some mistakes were cheaper to lose than to carry forward. Agnes Bell, Edwin Moss, and Parker spread every bundle of sorted fleece across the church loft floor. This time, they stopped trying to force one material to do every job. The long outer fibers became the blanket's weathering face. The stronger middle fibers formed the warp. The fine, crimped underwool filled the center, where trapped air mattered more than weight. Edwin rebuilt the weave from the inside out. Instead of pressing everything into one thick layer, he wove two light fabrics and joined them with evenly spaced ties, creating shallow air pockets between them. The blanket could hold warmth without crushing the loft that made it useful. The edges were reinforced with hemp warp to prevent uneven shrinking. After weaving, the blanket was fulled only enough to lock the fibers together while preserving their spring. The second prototype measured nearly 7 by 8 feet. It weighed just under 12 pounds. Parker carried out a simple test inside the cold barn. 2 identical tin pails were filled with the same amount of hot water. One was wrapped in an ordinary trade blanket. The other was covered with the new veil blanket. 4 hours later, the water beneath the veil blanket was still noticeably warmer. Dr. Elias Ward examined the result before quietly shaking his head. "A pail isn't a man." Parker nodded. The next test belonged outdoors. Cal Danner, a freight driver who hauled supplies through mountain roads at night, bought the blanket without asking for promises. 3 days later, he returned. He laid the blanket across Parker's workbench. "It kept me warm," Cal said. "That's not why I'm back." One corner had pulled out of shape after repeated freezing and thawing. The edge no longer lay flat. Parker refunded every dollar without argument. That evening, he removed the entire border stitch by stitch. The hemp warp had shrunk differently from the surrounding wool because it had never been conditioned before weaving. He prepared new hemp cord, soaked and dried it until its movement matched the blanket, then rebuilt the edge from the beginning. Cal took the blanket again. Several mornings later, he returned through a heavy frost. This time he never handed it back. He simply placed the payment on Parker's workbench. "My harness was frozen solid," he said, "but everything under that blanket stayed dry and warm." Parker picked up the money. Instead of slipping it into his coat, he opened Thaddeus Crow's ledger and laid every dollar against the debt. In October 1887, after the second blanket prototype had proven itself, Parker carried 36 pounds of carefully sorted wool to Horace Bellum's railroad warehouse. The outer fleece rested in one burlap bundle. The stronger middle fibers filled another. The fine underwool was tied separately with hemp cord. Each bundle carried a handwritten label explaining its purpose. Horace never untied a single one. He placed all three onto the scale together. The price he offered matched the lowest grade of mixed wool clip. Parker quietly explained that the fleece had already been sorted by hand. Horace nodded. "It doesn't matter." He pointed toward a freight ledger on his desk. "The mills outside Omaha buy by weight and consistency. You've got too little for a separate bale, too much variation for a contract, and too much labor already tied up in it." Parker lifted the bundle of underwool. "Feel this." Horace stepped back. "My hands won't change the price sheet." The money on the table would not cover the cost of salt, hardwood ash, lamp oil, and freight. Parker wrapped each bundle again with the same care he had used before opening them. He said nothing. On his way home, he stopped beside the blacksmith shop, where Silas Vane was warming his hands over the forge. "So," Silas asked, "did your miracle wool pay the interest?" Parker rested the bundles against the wall. "Horace doesn't buy warmth." He looked down at the tightly tied hemp cords. "He buys weight." That evening, Parker spread the finished blanket across the kitchen table. Agnes and Edwin had spent months turning raw fleece into something completely different. If he sold the wool alone, every hour of sorting, washing, spinning, and weaving would disappear inside an ordinary bale. Before going to bed, he opened his notebook. He wrote only one sentence: "Do not sell the part the buyer knows how to cheapen." Parker never carried another sack of sorted fleece to the railroad warehouse. From that day forward, he sold only finished blankets. The first customer after Cal Danner was Hester Pike, who kept the mercantile that supplied much of Greyhaven. Her elderly father slept beside the stove every night and still woke with stiff, purple hands before sunrise. She never mentioned Eamon Vale. She never asked about double-coated sheep. She only said Cal had crossed frozen roads with a dry back. And that was enough. Before she left, Parker explained exactly how the blanket should be used. Never place it directly on frozen ground. Lay dry straw, boards, or animal hides underneath first. Spread the blanket loosely instead of wrapping it tightly, so as not to crush the loft that trapped warm air. Air it outside on clear, dry afternoons. Never dry it beside a blazing stove. 3 days later, Hester returned. Her father had slept through the night without asking for another armload of firewood. From that day on, she clipped a small sample of Vale wool behind the counter of her mercantile and invited anyone who doubted it to squeeze the fibers with their own hands. Orders arrived one at a time. A blanket for the telegraph operator. Another for a family caring for a premature baby. A riding cloak for the mail carrier, who crossed Granite Horn twice a week. Parker never lowered the price. Every blanket demanded weeks of careful work. If one failed, every promise behind it failed as well. When the first payments finally came in, Parker did not buy more sheep. He walked straight to Thaddeus Crow's office in town and laid the money on the ledger. Thaddeus counted the coins twice before writing down the payment. By the spring of 1888, orders were arriving slowly but steadily. Agnes Bell and Edwin Moss could no longer keep up alone. Parker divided every day between the sheep, the barn, the blankets, and the debt that still waited at the end of each month. One morning, a 17-year-old girl named Clara Wynne walked into Harrow Ridge. Her family's homestead had failed after 2 dry summers left almost no hay to cut. She did not ask for charity. "Is there any work," she asked, "that needs careful hands more than strong ones?" Parker led her to the wool shed. "You'll sort fleece." On her 3rd day, Clara stopped in front of a stack of burlap sacks. Something felt wrong. She pushed her hand deep into the pile. The wool hidden near the bottom was noticeably warmer than the layers above it. When she pulled her hand back, it carried a faint sour smell. Parker. He came immediately. The fleece had been stacked too tightly, while it still held moisture. Heat was building inside the pile, mold or worse. Spontaneous heating could ruin nearly everything they had stored. It was Parker's mistake. Together they emptied every sack onto raised drying racks. During dry afternoons they opened the south doors, allowing fresh air to move through the shed. Cedar chips and dried sage were spread around the walls to discourage moths before the fleece went back into storage. Clara proved even faster than Parker at recognizing different grades of fiber by touch alone. Agnes taught her how to wash wool without disturbing its loft. Edwin showed her how to pluck a stretched warp thread and judge its tension by sound. That evening, Parker opened his notebook. Instead of writing another correction beneath his own name, he added a new line: Clara Wynn Wool Storage and Quality Inspection. Around the same time, the ewe with the crooked horn gave birth to twin ewe lambs. Both carried noticeably thicker underwool than most of the flock. Late that afternoon, Clara picked up a piece of charcoal and carefully wrote her name on the small board beside the woolshed door. The letters were so small they almost disappeared. When she returned the next morning, the same name had been written again. Larger. Straighter. Parker never mentioned it. Early in the winter of 1888, a 3-day cold spell locked every creek around Greyhaven beneath solid ice. It was not the great blizzard, but it was cold enough to test the blankets under real conditions. Dr. Elias Ward placed 2 Vail blankets in the rear room of his clinic. One covered an elderly miner struggling with pneumonia. The other wrapped a newborn whose weight worried everyone in the room. Both held their warmth longer than patients using ordinary trade blankets. A few days later, another family came with a complaint. The blanket doesn't work. Parker rode to their sod house himself. The father lay directly on the frozen earthen floor. The blanket had been wrapped tightly around his body until the loft had nearly disappeared. His shirt was damp with sweat. Parker never argued. He and Silas raised the bed on rough planks. They packed thick, dry straw beneath it and hung an old blanket beside the bed to create a smaller pocket of warm air around the sleeper. The next morning, the same Vail blanket performed very differently. Dr. Ward pointed toward the bed. A body loses heat more than one way, he said. Wind steals the warm air around it. Frozen ground pulls heat away by contact. Moisture speeds every loss. And a stove wastes fuel heating empty space no one is using. Parker listened without interrupting. That evening, he wrote a short sheet of instructions for every blanket. Never sleep directly on frozen ground. Raise the bed whenever possible. Keep the bedding dry. Do not wrap the blanket so tightly that it crushes its own loft. Air it outside on clear, dry afternoons instead of drying it beside the fire. Hester Pike copied the instructions by hand and tucked one into every order that left her store. Silas watched all of it in silence. At last, he understood something he had never expected to learn from Parker. The blanket was never the whole answer. It was only one good part of a system that had to work together. The father in the sod house woke the following morning to find frost still covering the inside of the door. His little daughter, sleeping beside him beneath the same blanket, no longer shivered. He never thanked Parker. Before nightfall, he simply spread another layer of dry straw beneath the bed. By late January 1889, the signs began to gather. For 2 mornings in a row, a pale ring of ice circled the sun. Magpies abandoned the open fields and settled near the barnyard fences. Without being driven, the flock left the western slope and crowded against the eastern ridge where the wind rarely reached. An unusually warm Chinook breeze died before sunset. Smoke climbed straight from the chimney, then suddenly flattened against the roof. Parker compared every sign with Eamon Vail's notebook. None of them guaranteed a blizzard. Together, they had appeared before the 2 worst winters Eamon had ever recorded. Parker never rode into Greyhaven shouting warnings. He simply prepared. Clean fleece was moved from the smaller shed into the main barn. The firewood stack was lifted off the ground and covered with heavy planks. Every chimney cap was inspected. Another wind baffle was added inside the barn. 46 finished blankets and 19 riding cloaks were loaded onto a wagon and delivered to Hester Pike's mercantile. Parker also asked Reverend Amos Flint to unlock the church if the roads disappeared beneath snow. It would never be enough, not for the whole town. He counted the blankets again. 10 of the best should stay at Harrow Ridge. Miriam, Clara, Agnes, Edwin, the people who lived and worked there. Miriam listened without interrupting. Then she quietly folded the finest blanket they had ever made, carried it outside, and laid it on the wagon. "Take it to the church," she said. She offered no explanation. She didn't have to. There were more children in Greyhaven than there were people at Harrow Ridge. Parker stood beside the wagon for a long moment. He almost reached for the blanket. Before he could, Miriam had already gone back inside. Through the frosted window, he saw her spread her old patched blanket across her own bed. When the wagon finally rolled toward town, 6 blankets remained behind. On the night of February 2, 1889, the blizzard arrived. The first wind came out of the northwest. It stripped old snow from the ground before fresh snow even began to fall. By dawn, the railroad tracks had vanished. The telegraph poles hummed until the line snapped somewhere north of Greyhaven. The last temperature recorded at the depot read 31 degrees below zero before ice sealed the instrument. Snow buried north-facing doors. Firewood left outdoors froze into solid blocks. Low chimneys filled houses with smoke instead of drawing it away. Reverend Amos Flint opened the church before sunrise. The pews were carried against the walls. Hester Pike handed out blankets according to need, never according to who had paid for them. The oldest came first, then the children, then the sick, then families whose fires had already gone out. Dr. Elias Ward placed the weakest beside the cast-iron stove. Working side by side, Parker and Edwin hung veil blankets from ropes stretched across the church, dividing the large sanctuary into smaller chambers that trapped warm air around the people instead of wasting it beneath the high ceiling. Clean fleece was packed between muslin and empty flour sacks to make emergency quilts before nightfall. Outside, Silas Vane organized rescue sleds. No one knew the sheltered trails through drifting snow better than he did. And no horses in the valley were stronger. Parker stayed only long enough to finish the shelter. Then, he turned back toward Harrow Ridge. 133 sheep still depended on the barn. So did Miriam, Agnes, and Clara. By the second day, the road between the farm and Greyhaven no longer existed. That afternoon, Silas brought 2 shivering children into the church. Without hesitation, a woman slipped the veil blanket from her own shoulders and wrapped it around them. Before anyone noticed what she had done, Hester quietly covered the woman with one of the rough emergency quilts. No one spoke of sacrifice. There was still too much work to do. By the third night, the cast-iron stove inside the church began pushing smoke back into the room. Snow had packed tightly around the chimney cap, forcing the draft downward. People coughed. Eyes watered. The warm center of the shelter slowly began to cool. Parker could not leave Harrow Ridge. The northern wind had torn loose the barn's upper baffle, driving snow into the first sheep pen. Working in darkness, he and Agnes nailed fresh boards into place while Miriam held a lantern until a fit of coughing forced her to sit against the wall. In Greyhaven, the church became Silas Vane's responsibility. A rope was tied around his waist before he crawled onto the roof. Reverend Amos wrapped the other end around a roof beam inside the attic. Ice had sealed the chimney, opening almost completely. With one hand gripping the frozen bricks, Silas chipped away at the ice as the wind tried to pull him from the roof. Inside the church, Edwin lowered the hanging blanket walls even farther to hold the remaining warmth close to the people. Dr. Ward moved the sick away from the thickening smoke. Clara had just arrived with another wagon of clean fleece. Working beside Hester, she quickly stitched muslin and wool together into insulated panels that covered cracked windows before more heat escaped. On the 4th day, Silas found his 89-year-old mother-in-law inside a cabin where the last piece of firewood had already burned away. She barely responded when he carried her into the church. Dr. Ward wrapped her in the very first blanket Miriam had sent from Harrow Ridge. Dry straw and animal hides were placed beneath her before she was moved into the warm center of the shelter. Late that night, she swallowed her first cup of hot water. Hours later, her eyes finally opened. She looked at the blanket before she looked at Silas. Without saying a word, she held tightly to its edge. Silas removed his wet gloves, laid them beside the stove to dry, and sat quietly at her side. He never mentioned that he had once laughed at the very wool now keeping her alive. The blizzard lasted 8 days. By the 5th day, the church was running out of coal. Without being asked, Horace Bellum unlocked the railroad warehouse. Every roll of muslin, every coil of hemp rope, every burlap sack, and every empty crate was carried to the shelter. Across town, Thaddeus Crowe stripped shelves and wooden partitions from the land office and split them into dry firewood. No one asked who would pay for any of it. The strongest adults slept along the outer walls. Children and the elderly remained in the warm center. Veil blankets were rotated throughout the day so each could dry completely before being used again. Their loft stayed intact because no blanket was left damp for long. Raw fleece filled cracks around doors, lined bedding, and wrapped hot water bottles before they were tucked beside the weakest survivors. At Harrow Ridge, the storm found one final weakness. Part of the smaller roof collapsed. 2 sheep were crushed beneath it. The other, 131, survived. When Parker finally had a quiet moment, he opened his notebook and recorded both losses separately. Nothing was erased. Nothing was rounded into a convenient number. Inside Greyhaven, 83 people spent the 3 coldest nights inside the church. One elderly man, found too late in a cabin north of town, never reached the shelter. The storm ended anyway. It offered no explanations. When the wind finally stopped, the silence felt unfamiliar. Families dug their front doors open from the inside. The veil blankets smelled of smoke, damp wool, and long nights without sleep. Their edges were scorched. Their colors had darkened beneath soot. None of them looked new anymore. Every one of them had worked. Thaddeus reopened his ledger. The pages had curled from damp air and smoke. He looked at the names. Then he closed the book again without writing a single line. A little girl woke beneath one of the blankets and listened to the stillness. "Why is it so quiet?" she whispered. No one answered. For the first time in 8 days, many of them had forgotten what a room sounded like when the wind was no longer trying to come inside. Several weeks after the blizzard, Silas Vane rode alone to Harrow Ridge. He carried the first veil blanket. It had been washed clean, but one corner still bore a dark scorch mark from the church stove. "My mother-in-law still sleeps under this one," he said. Inside the barn, Silas stood quietly among the flock. The sheep had grown thinner through the winter, but they were alive. For a long moment, he watched them without speaking. Finally, he looked at Parker. "I knew sheep." He rested one hand on the weathered fence rail. "I knew which breeds gained weight, which feet held up on stone, which lambs to keep." His voice remained calm. "But I did not know that wool." He never apologized for laughing at the auction. Instead, he made an offer. A sheltered 38-acre pasture on the east side of his ranch would be available the following winter if Parker wished to graze the Vale flock there during the harshest weather. In return, Silas asked for 6 of Ashi's best ewe lambs to begin a small breeding flock of his own. Parker remained silent. Then he answered, "I'll agree to it." Silas waited. "On one condition. You don't cross them just to make them heavier." Silas nodded once. "I won't." Before winter returned, Thaddeus Crowe stamped the Hale ledger with the words "interest paid." A few days later, Hester Pike climbed the hill carrying a folded order book. Both pages were filled. Miriam smiled when she saw it. She never counted the names. She only closed the book and handed it back. She passed away late that autumn in her own bed beneath a third-generation veil blanket, spun by Clara Wynne and woven by Edwin Moss. When Parker entered the room, her right hand still rested lightly on the hemp-bound edge, as though she had been checking the seam one last time. After the funeral, Parker carefully lifted the blanket from the bed. He carried it toward the wash kettle. Clara quietly stopped him. She pointed to the shallow crease Miriam's hand had left along the border. Neither of them spoke. Together, they folded the blanket without smoothing that final mark away. In the years that followed, demand grew far beyond what Harrow Ridge could produce. Horace Bellum eventually offered to purchase every Vale blanket under an exclusive contract and ship them east. Parker declined. Horace could carry the blankets. He would never control the flock, the local price, or the knowledge behind them. Rather than building the largest sheep operation in the valley, Parker and Clara chose a different path. The best ewe lambs, many descended from Asheye, were divided into small starter flocks. They went first to families with rocky land but dependable winter grass, to homesteads too poor to raise heavy meat breeds, to settlements beyond easy reach of coal or timber, and only to people willing to learn how to sort fleece instead of selling it as mixed wool. Agnes Bell taught wool preparation until her hands could no longer turn the spinning wheel for an entire afternoon. Edwin left behind careful drawings of the double-layer loom before age, finally silenced the workshop. Dr. Elias Ward added practical notes on staying dry, insulating against frozen ground, and building smaller pockets of warm air instead of trying to heat an entire room. Behind the counter of Hester Pike's Mercantile, one smoke-blackened corner of the first Vale blanket remained on display beside the list of 83 names sheltered inside the church during the blizzard. By then, Clara had earned a breeding flock of her own. Its finest ewe was a granddaughter of the crooked-horned sheep everyone had once expected to die in the auction pen. Years later, a letter arrived from a widower in Montana. He owned 60 acres of rocky ground that everyone around him considered worthless. He asked whether Parker would sell him 6 breeding ewes and whether someone could teach him how to use them properly. Parker answered at the same kitchen table where Miriam had once laid Eamon Vale's notebook beside the family's last $50. Before sealing the letter, he wrote one final sentence. Do not ask what the market calls it in a good year. Ask what winter calls it when the fire goes out. He folded the letter and opened his notebook. Besides 6 small marks, he recorded the names of the ewe lambs, leaving Harrow Ridge that spring. The last mark belonged to Asheye's closest descendant. His pencil rested there for a long moment. Then he finished the entry. Keeping every good sheep would have protected one farm. Sharing them would strengthen many. Outside the window, the flock stood with their backs to the wind. The youngest lambs rested quietly in the shelter of the circle. Winter had not disappeared. It never would. But across Greyhaven, and in distant valleys beyond it, there were now more places where winter found fewer lives to take.